My name is Brian Fidler. I was born on the 19th of October 1938 in Manchester. We're at the moment in Oxford, which is where we've lived for a long, long time. We're looking out on the dreaming spires, and we've got the opportunity, hopefully, of telling you something about my memories of a very, very special lady. But the special lady is somebody that you will know as Anne-Marie. And we always called her Marie. I've no idea why. That's the way it started, that's the way it ended. She was very happy with it, and that was her name as far as we were concerned. She came into our life because my parents, I was the first child, the only child at that stage. My parents had gone to a local seaside resort called Southport, which is quite near Manchester, and they stayed in a lovely Jewish boarding house. We were there probably for a week or 2 weeks, I don't know exactly. And during the time that we were there, my mother came back to the bedroom and found a very, very nice young lady, girl, call her what you will, who was sitting on the bed sobbing dreadfully, bitterly, deeply. Well, she was working there as a domestic help, as a chambermaid. She and her sister Irma were both working at the same hotel, and there was a recent edict. The war had by then started, September 1939. There was a recent edict that anybody who was regarded as a potential enemy alien, and they were, because they were German citizens, gave, I think they had a week's notice, and they had to move within 30 miles of the coast. The danger, the perceived danger, being that they were going to send signals to submarines and do all sorts of dreadful things. And that was the way it was going to be. They were given no alternative, they were given no choice, nor were they given any idea as to where they should go to. My mother was a very empathetic, a very sympathetic and supportive woman. And she said to Marie, "Don't worry about it, don't get upset. Here's the keys to our house in Manchester. You and your sister go there. We'll be back in about a week's time. Make yourself at home, and we'll sort it all out when we arrive back." I think her main concern was that here was some poor individual who had nowhere to go and didn't know who to turn to. They knew nobody. So they were in a really tough situation, and it was great that they were able to find at least some immediate respite, some relief, somewhere to go to, with the knowledge that somebody, although they didn't know my parents, my mother at all, somebody was prepared to hold out a hand to them. I don't think that they were aware in any detail sense, because the war had only just started. What was supposedly, I say supposedly in inverted commas, going on in Germany was not generally known to a lot of people outside Germany. There was a general awareness that Hitler had come to power, the Nuremberg laws had come in, there were a lot of things that were very, very unhappy as far as the Jewish community was concerned. But the Jewish community in Germany was absolutely minute. It was less than 1% of the population. And therefore, although there were difficulties, the real horrors, the nightmares, were first of all happening outside Germany, even later on, but were only happening post-1939, post-1940. So they were aware that there was a problem with refugees coming to this country, but I don't think there was an awareness of really the horrors that lay behind it, or that lay in the future. Well, a lot of this is apocryphal, as you will imagine, because even at 15 months old, there's a limit to how much I can remember in great detail. My mother, that is, was very keen to help other people in any way that she possibly could. This wasn't peculiar to Marie, this wasn't peculiar to refugees. This was part of what made her the person she was and the life that she led over the rest of her lifetime. And I think that what happened is that she realised she couldn't find accommodation for two people. The house that we had was only a small 3-bedroom house. But she could make room for one of the two sisters, and Marie seemed to be the one that hit the button, as it were. And she made an arrangement for Irma to go somewhere else. I don't know where it was, I don't know who it was with. but they split up. They were both in Manchester, but they split up and they went to different places. Marie staying where she was with us, and Irma going on to some other Jewish person. I can only guess that my mother was finding looking after a squawking little one, namely me, was pretty time consuming in addition to everything else that she was trying to do. And therefore the possibility of somebody coming to help, to give her a little bit of respite, to take care of some of the more difficult day-to-day things that are terribly time-consuming. Remember, this is in the days before all the wonders of automatic washing machines and microwaves and all the things that we totally take for granted now. And I think it was just a very welcome opportunity. It was one of those win-win situations where it suited Marie, obviously, absolutely down to the ground, and it worked very well for my mother as well, because she felt she was doing something to help what was happening in Europe. And it also gave her the opportunity of having more freedom to devote more of her attention to other things that she was very much committed to. Marie's English, the whole of my recollection from when I was, I suppose, 4 or 5 years old and I was really able to remember specifics, right through to the very last time that she came here to stay with us, was a totally unchanged vocabulary and a very heavily accented way of speaking. Her syntax, her ability to express herself was absolutely first class from as far back as I can remember. But actually listening to her talk, I could listen to her, if I answered the phone and it was Marie on the phone or I'd phoned her, she only had to say 2 or 3 words and I instantly knew who it was. It was a very distinctive accent and it didn't change at all. But she was able to express herself, both technically and in day-to-day terms, to an exceptionally high standard. She carved out a niche in the family, and certainly with me, that was very distinctive, very special, and rather unique. She was a much more intelligent person than my mother. She was a much better educated person than my mother. And I found that my mother was providing the sort of regular middle-class Jewish love, care and attention, what have you, but Marie was able to make good all these other areas, like music, like a whole range of sort of intellectual stimuli that just made her something special for me. And I suppose kids are pretty selfish creatures. Certainly my experience of our own and now our 8 grandchildren would reinforce this. She was mine. She was the person that was there for me. I do accept that there were probably 1 or 2 other things that she did have to do. But as far as I was concerned, Marie and I were an inseparable couple. And that was something very, very special that transcended childhood and moved right through the rest of our lives. Yes. And she did it in a very kindly way, a very interesting way. Music was no problem because music crosses all sorts of linguistic and national barriers. Music is music. Literature is different because she obviously was much more comfortable with German literature than English literature. I didn't speak any German, and interestingly, perhaps not surprisingly, but interestingly, she never ever spoke German with us. It was, well, as I said a moment ago, understandably, as if she'd brought a curtain down. And that was something that was just not a place she wanted to go. Not because there was any deep trauma that I was aware of, certainly as a child, but it was just, it was a part of her life when not only had she closed the door on it, but metaphorically she'd thrown the key away. Yes, she was. She would have probably been a year or 2 younger than my mother, but no great difference in age. There was no sort of feminine competition between them. They worked together, they lived together, they loved together. It was a very, very special relationship that didn't represent any threat to either of them, because I suppose that there was a mutual dependency. that overcame any possible slight tensions that there might have otherwise been, but I was never aware of any. This may sound a bizarre and not a very praiseworthy comment about myself. I don't know that I ever did. I mean, she was just always there. She was part of the family. She was just Marie, and that's the way life was. Maybe I wasn't too bright either, or maybe children just accept things as they are. But I was never conscious that she was from a different country, that she was from a different background, that she'd been part, directly or indirectly, of some sort of horrendous trauma. She spoke differently, but that had always been the way. No, I just wasn't conscious of it. Manchester was a major industrial city. It was a major hub of aircraft manufacture and of engineering, and it was bombed very, very heavily indeed. Manchester and Liverpool were the two obvious northern targets. Birmingham also, I suppose. I can remember on one or two occasions, and I suppose this would be mid-40s, I can't remember the exact date, where I would look out of the window, as we're looking out of the window here, and it was at night, and it was as if there were 20, 30, 40 orange floodlights on, pointing up at the sky. And they weren't searchlights. This was buildings that were burning. Massive, massive incendiary bomb attacks, quite deliberately trying to destroy the factories. And I was fascinated in one way by this huge orange glow. It looked like an incredible sunset, but it was 2 or 3 hours after the sunset had actually taken place. Fascinated on the one hand and terrified on the other, because there was clearly something going on that was pretty bad news. And another aspect of exactly the same thing, my father, who I haven't mentioned at all so far, was involved in fairly large-scale manufacturing in the centre of Manchester. It was producing war materials, so he was allowed not to be in the army. And one of the jobs that he used to have, that he used to tell me about, that was quite fascinating, apart from running the business on a day-to-day basis, was that at night they were on fire watch duty, and this was seriously low-tech, unbelievably low-tech. What they used to do is they had to sleep in a tent on the flat roof of the factory with broomsticks, like you'd sweep the road with. And when the incendiary bombs were dropped, and they were quite deliberately incendiary bombs rather than high explosive, they would drop on the factory roof, and his job was to get the broom and flick it over the edge onto the pavement, and then it burnt and didn't do any harm. And then they'd sort of climb back in their tent and do whatever they did until the next one dropped. So we were very aware of there was a real war going on, and it was going on our doorstep, not in the way that it would be happening on a battlefield, and certainly not in the way that it would be happening as far as the camps and the Jews were concerned. But this wasn't just something that you read in the newspaper. She used to talk to my parents about it on and off, but not as a frequent thing. And again, I can remember overhearing stories, all the dreadful things that children do. You'd get put to bed, and then the adults would get together and do whatever they were doing, and then you'd climb out of bed and lie on your tummy on the landing, hopefully with your head not totally stuck through the banisters, and listen to what was going on. And this was fascinating stuff. And some of the stories that I remember her telling my mother about what life was like in Germany, in her hometown, was pretty horrendous, about a next door neighbour who was Jewish and who was pregnant, and the Nazis came in and they just threw this woman down 3 flights of steps. Obviously she was killed, the baby was dead. And it was the sort of thing that as a child you listened to, and there's again this bizarre combination of utter fascination. You know, this can't be true, this can't be real, this is better than you read in books. I'm sorry to use the word better. But on the other hand, to be totally horrified that this could actually be happening, that abnormal human beings were doing this to each other while I was alive, while I was sitting here in Manchester, while I was lying on my tummy listening to this story. And it was that very, very curious juxtaposition that I found intensely memorable, and that's why I can recall it now so readily. I can to some extent, and looking back on it, it does surprise me a little bit, but maybe this was the personality as much as anything else. It was recalled in a very almost clinical, slightly cold way. It was telling a story as it was. These are the facts. The one thing I can remember, and looking back on it, I don't understand why she felt the way she did. I was never aware of any rancour or bitterness about it. There was a sadness that this had gone and this was behind her and all the things that might have been. But there wasn't any sort of deep-rooted hatred. And if that had been me, but maybe, I don't know, everyone reacts differently, I think I would have been unable to regard this as simply retelling the facts without emotion. Not really, no. I think probably she had become so integrated in our family, both in the narrower sense and our wider family, because both my parents came from large families. One had 8 brothers and sisters, the other one had 9. So there was a huge extended family, and there was always something going on. And Marie was always part of that. It wasn't as if she came along to look after me, as if she came along to do X or Y or whatever else it was. She was an integral part of the family. She was just with us all the time. She lived with us in every sense of the word. I'm sure that there were local organisations, clubs, movements, whatever it was, where she could and would have met other people from a similar background. But it wasn't something that I was aware of. She never brought people back home. She was the sort of mentor, she was the rock. She was the one that I could always go to if there was anything that didn't quite hang together in the way that I would like it to have done, either with my parents or with my parents and one of their siblings. I mean, in a large family like that, this is good, high-quality Jewish stuff, you understand. There's always somebody that you've fallen out with in the family. The best sort of foibles are those that are so deeply rooted you can't even remember what they were about. And Marie was the person that I could always go back to, that if there was some hassle going on between my mother and my mother's sister, or between my brother-in-law, or her brother-in-law, Marie was there for me. And that sounds a very selfish comment. But as I said earlier, maybe kids are selfish. The starting point, which is psychologically brilliant, is, okay, tell me all about it. In other words, download, get it off your chest, gives me time to think, says Marie. Let's just talk it through. Because so often, and I'm sure that you found this in your own life, if you talk an issue through, the perspective changes. The villains suddenly morph into difficult but reasonably okay guys. And it was just the ability, the encouragement to talk it through and then to make 1 or 2 odd suggestions here and there. And you'd go away feeling a lot better. If one actually analysed what she'd said and what she'd done, it probably wasn't an awful lot. You know, there wasn't sort of 17 pages of detail, this is what you do. It was just a feeling that I've got it off my chest, I feel better about it, I've actually got a slightly better balance and perspective on it. Although you would never articulate this as a young child, thank you, that was really very good. I appreciated that, because you never said that. But that was what was going on. Given her own preferences, I don't think she would have moved on. My mother was a relatively uneducated person, but a very, very ambitious individual. And she was desperately keen for everybody that she came into contact with to do the very best that they were able to do, to achieve their optimum. It's something that followed through her life and into our life and into our grandchildren's lives in terms of a value set. And I can remember her pushing harder and harder and harder to Marie to say, look, this is ridiculous. You're a highly intelligent person. You're very well qualified. There's a desperate need in the country for people like you. Why don't you do such and such and such and such? And radiotherapy, radiography, was her particular background. Marie's, not my mother. And she pushed her to going down to London to King's College Hospital to get a job there in the radiography department. I can't remember the name of the doctor that she worked with in Germany. That's right, yes. He was involved in a very early form of radiography, and Marie worked with him as a sort of unqualified assistant, but picked up an awful lot from that working relationship and from what she saw. And I suppose, going back, that was part of the sadness that I referred to earlier. Sadness, not bitterness. That this is all that could have been, this is what she wanted to do, this was what was happening in Germany. She had the opportunity of being, if not at the leading edge, certainly fairly close to it, and then it was all taken away from her. So that was her background, and she went down and she got a job, and as you will know, she ended up as head of the entire department. Interestingly, just to show that life's got so many twists and turns in it, my wife was also a radiographer before we married. And our eldest daughter, who is now a consultant at St Mary's Paddington, also worked at King's Cross Hospital where Marie was. I remember long, probably 3 or 4 or 5 days, long periods when she disappeared and I didn't know where she'd gone. And I was conscious that my mother was on the one hand pushing her to go and do something else, but I didn't realise this meant leaving Manchester, for God's sake. You know, London. Well, when she actually went, it just left an enormous hole because there was nobody there to fill it. And it was, I'm sorry to keep using the same word because it's self-critical. I felt rather selfishly let down by it. I mean, this wasn't the deal. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. She was clearly there forever. And all of a sudden she wasn't. She'd gone. And because moving from one part of the country, never mind overseas in those days, was not all that easy, we didn't have a lot of continuing contact with her. We saw her regularly, but I mean, it wasn't every week or every fortnight. We maybe saw her 2 or 3 times a year. No, it faded away in my late teens, and then we got married in 1962. We came here to Oxford, and we had contact with her through my mother. She and my mother still saw each other regularly, a couple of times a year, and she would go and stay with my mother for anything up to a week. And then if we knew that she was there, we would go down and we would all get together. And that's where we started to pick up the pieces. And it was only really in the last 15 years that we started to pick up a relationship again with Marie, but a direct relationship rather than through a vicarious one where my mother was involved. There was a little spark of it, but I mean, there's a huge gap here. We're talking of a gap of 40 years or whatever, possibly even a little bit more than that. We talked about a whole variety of things, and I just enjoyed talking to her about history, not German, not Holocaust, not sort of particularly, but history generally, which has always been a deep love of mine, to talk about music, to talk about politics, to talk about members of the family. You always inevitably end up doing that when you meet up with people that you've known in previous, what's so-and-so doing and what happened to so-and-so and do you know whatever. But it was a very easy relationship, and it's, for me, one of the measures of the quality of any relationship, whether it's with old friends, old university colleagues, whatever else, where you can pick up the threads literally within 5 or 10 minutes. And I won't say it's as if you've been together without any gap at all. That's unreal. But you can very easily pick up, you can begin to tune in or retune in to the empathy that there was and to those particular areas of comfort and sensitivity that there was between you. And you pick it up and away you go. She was 80% a member of the family, but 20% my special friend. And if I had to encompass our relationship in 3 words or 4 words or whatever it is, my special friend would be the way I'd describe it. She was very serious, very focused, not a huge sense of humour, a nice, easy touch, but not a huge sense of humour. Somebody who was somehow able to straddle lots and lots of different strands of life. I always got the impression that what we saw in the latter years was just part of her. Because she got involved, as you will know, in so many different things. She had the ability to make you feel as if you were what life was all about at that moment. And that's a very, very special talent. And she had it, big time. I wasn't aware of the real depth and involvement that she had in music in her later life, but I was very much aware of how much music meant to her in terms of sheer pleasure, almost a form of escapism. And maybe that was what helped her keep her sanity in the early 1940s, where she could retreat into her music and she would disappear for hours on end, listening to music on her own, and come out refreshed, renewed, peaceful. So it obviously meant a huge amount to her. A very great sadness that a wonderful life had inevitably come to an end, but it happens to all of us. It wasn't a life that was cut short, it wasn't foreshortened. She'd lived to a wonderful age. She'd been able to do so many of the things that I guess at one stage were not only just a dream, but a dream that had been shattered. And she'd had the tenacity and the focus and the determination and the single-mindedness to pick up the pieces and literally glue them back together again and make something that was not only as good as it had been previously, but something that was even better in her professional life, in her musical life, and in her social life.